As the Middle East dominates headlines, it's very important to remember the other grinding conflict in Ukraine. 2.5 years on, Russia controls roughly a fifth of Ukraine's territory. Meanwhile, Ukraine still holds that slice of Russian territory it captured this summer. So what are the hopes of a settlement and a lasting peace? I want to bring in Admiral James Stavridis. He was NATO's Supreme Allied Commander between 2009 to 2013. And unlike most military leaders, he is also an accomplished writer of fiction. His latest novel, which is a must-read, is called The Restless Wave. Jim, I've got to ask you, because we have you about Ukraine.
Sure.
When you look at it right now, there's a lot of concern that the Russians are gaining ground, that Ukraine is holding on to these parts of the Donbass, and it's very fragile. What does it look like to you?
It looks a lot to me, unfortunately, like the end of the Korean War. What I mean by that is it seems highly unlikely that Vladimir Putin is going to be dislodged from the 20% of Ukraine he currently holds. As a result of that, we ought to begin thinking about a negotiation, an armistice, freeze the frame. Perhaps in the time ahead, the Ukrainians can renegotiate for that lost portion. But the real goal, Fareed, is to get the rest of Ukraine sailing on, free, democratic, part of NATO, part of the European Union.
So we'll get to that second part in a bit. But first, I want to ask you, the Ukrainians believe very strongly that they can still gain more momentum, more advantage, that this is part of what they have asked President Biden for. And one of the things they keep asking for is this ability to strike into Russia itself, to use, if Russia is launching missiles from Russian territory, they should be able to strike those bases. So I've talked to administration officials. They believe this is not as big a deal as the Ukrainians make it out, that the Russians could pull those guns back, that this is more symbolic. What do you think?
I think militarily, I would want to take the shackles off Ukraine. And that's both militarily important because the Ukrainians can strike into deep targets that are air-based, long-range missile strikes. That's a real military target. And by the way, if you're forcing the Russians to push those 500 miles away, they become ineffective. So I think it is a big deal. We ought to unleash the Ukrainians, tell them, don't go to Moscow, don't go after civilian population centers, but military targets, 300 or so miles into Russia, makes both symbolic and military sense.
So now let's get to the issue of Ukraine. You were the Supreme Allied Commander in NATO. How would you provide a NATO membership to a country when a fifth of its territory is occupied by Russia? Does that mean the minute Ukraine joins NATO, NATO is now at war with Russia because Russia and Ukraine are still kind of warring on that front?
I think this is why it's crucial that we have a negotiation that gets to an armistice. If we can stop the hostilities, have a ceasefire with an armistice, perhaps agreed roughly along the lines that exist now, I think that is the key that would unlock the door to bring Ukraine into NATO. And there might be a halfway house, Fareed. You might start with a security guarantee that's short of a full membership. But I think over time, NATO wants Ukraine inside NATO. And I'll tell you why. When this is over, Ukraine will have the most highly blooded, technologically capable, and innovative land force in Europe. We want them on Team NATO.
When you talk about moving toward a negotiation, you need two sides to negotiate.
Yeah.
Do you think Putin is ready? What would make him ready? And isn't he waiting perhaps for the outcome of the November election?
100%. He's waiting for the outcome of the election because he sees a real difference. And I think it's a realistic expectation on his part. President Trump, former President Trump, has been very skeptical of Ukraine, whereas Vice President Harris has been very supportive. But what is pushing Putin toward a negotiation are his losses, his attrition. He's lost probably 1 million young Russian men, 200,000 killed in action, 400,000 grievously wounded, 600,000 have left the country in order to avoid the draft. None of that is good for Russia long term. He knows that. I think he would be willing to negotiate on the basis of where we are now after the election.
Always a pleasure to hear from you, Jim.
Thank you, Fareed.
For more on Admiral Stavridis' new book, The Restless Wave, go to cnn.com/Fareed for an extended interview about it.